It's my pleasure to introduce Bob Somol. Bob, as probably many of you know, is a recovered Angelino by now. I mean, he's been living in Chicago for quite a while right now. He's the director of the School of Architecture, University of Illinois at Chicago. And in many, many regards, I think many of the discussions and issues that are on the table these days were triggered not in a minor way by his writing and his discussion a while ago here in LA, and continue to the things and the work that has been doing over the years. Bob is a peculiar character in our field, since all his interest and background introduced the possibility to look at the world of architecture in a different way. So I thought that there were two guys and ideas that maybe can help to introduce him. One is from Hunter Thompson, and I really like this quote. I have a theory that the truth is never told during the 9 to 5 hours. Assuming that there is any truth that is being told at any given time. And one could argue that in many ways, the critical and theoretical discourse in architecture is never really about the pursuit of the truth, but it's much more about the pursuit of the massaging and manipulating the truth for the service of whatever argument that you're trying to build. In many ways, the work of Bob has been incredibly important in trying what I would say bring a sense of relax and a much more cool attitude towards the problem of critical thinking, particularly at the end of the 90s and beginning of 2000. And in many ways, I think the discussion that was framed at that time between difficult and easy in many ways shape and pave a lot of the issues that today we're trying to build into new coherencies. And today, Todd Gannon sent me as a present this clip, which I think is a pretty interesting and funny one in terms of what I'm trying to say, I think probably in a more clever way. If we can have sound.
Well, I really think that Buckminster Fuller's theory of environmental conditions could easily be applied to the problem of interurban architecture, particularly as it applies to the high-density population areas in the Northeast.
You took the words right out of my mouth, Jeff.
Well, I really think, my real theory is that the environmental conditions here in the rec room would be absolutely perfect for the Fleetwood Mac. Let's go listen to him.
Baby, if you got the right.
So, I'm not saying that Bob Somol is Hugh Hefner, but as comparison goes, that's not a really bad one to be compared to. In any case, I'm very curious to see where his work and thinking is. I know he's finishing a book. He's on sabbatical this year. Still that's the case, Bob? And finishing a book, so I'm really curious to see where his thoughts and comments and thinking in relation to architecture are these days. So I cannot think of anybody better to kick off this semester lecture series than Bob Somol.
It's nice to come back to LA, and thank you for all the friends who didn't discourage said students and Hernon from inviting me. Thanks for all the friendly faces in the crowd. I appreciate the invitation, although I don't know why you invited me, because you have Todd Gannon, who does a much more credible version than most of us than we do ourselves. So this is one of those things that we are going to lose something in the original. The other night also, I have to say, which goes to the one retort to Hugh Hefner, I got an email, of all people, from Wes Jones out of the blue. I never get an email from Wes Jones. He said, I just saw your lecture was announced. I'm sorry, I can't make it because it's my birthday. And by the way, it's also Hernon's birthday. So if you could, please give him a big hug. I kid you not, he said that. In lieu of a big hug, though, I give Hernon my best regards. And this, happy birthday, Hernon. Format's a little bit off, but that's for you. I'm not sure why Wes thought I would be the person to deliver the birthday message. Usually when we come in from Chicago to LA, it's just to leave a horse head on somebody's bed. But there you go. I will say that in this last fall, I've been in a number of unlikely groups among unlikely people, from new urbanists to parametricists to infrastructuralists. And I'm beginning to feel like I'm living that old expression, only Nixon could go to China. And I'm not sure if this is the last of those visits or the beginning of something else, but we'll figure that out. The title, as I said, the talk is in two parts, the part you heard and the part that you don't want to hear. The part you've heard is more the historical overview of a period from the mid-'60s to the mid-'90s, about 2/3 of it, and then I'm going to jump to a kind of contemporary Chicago-centric instance of maybe where we are and try to connect those two parts, the historical one and the emergence of a particular kind of architectural subject, which I call the architect critic, and kind of where we're situated now. I will say, if you stick around for that last third, there is a picture of Craig from 1977. It's very small, but you'll see him. I'll point him out. I think that the two dominant forms that this interest I have, let's say, in the relation or the realignment of words and things, because that's really what I'm talking about. You could say words and things, or you could say maybe books and buildings. Basically, two forms that things and words take, but also modes of seeing and saying, how we see things and how we say things in contemporary architecture. And I think the two dominant forms that that's taken in the period since the mid-'60s to the mid-'90s, more or less, is what I call the index and the speech act. In other words, how do we combine seeing and saying, or words and things? So part of that talk is that history and what happens afterwards. This is from a painting by Rémy Zaugg, the late Swiss artist, a longtime collaborator of Herzog de Meuron. They designed a studio. He designed the first Pompidou exhibition. They worked on master plans and building projects together, as you're well aware. Herzog and De Meuron at one point referred to him as their fifth partner. So you could say in a way that Zaugg provides writing and art to Herzog de Meuron by proxy. In other words, the two things that Herzog and De Meuron are explicitly extreme about saying they don't do. In other words, they collaborate with artists and others, but they don't do art and they don't do writing in a way. And so in a way, they would seem to be the beginning of some other story, but I want to put them in the narrative where they are actually you could say the apotheosis of the legacy that I'm talking about. And so I want to start, you could say at the end, or near where the end I hope will be of the first part, with this epigraph by Jacques Herzog. And I would say, despite its appearance, no architect has ever written a text which has survived more than one generation. What survives, what influences architecture, what makes architecture architecture is the work. I think on first appearances, you could say, that this would seem to be a kind of reversal of the legacy that I'm talking about with the emergence of the architect critic. Again, I see this really as a provocative overstatement or a kind of contrarian polemic. And the case I want to make, I guess, is that for me, what the job of theory or the idea of theory is a tool for derealizing the real, or for turning the real into a certain kind of fantasy. And I think that in that case, Herzog de Meuron's work is the most theoretical instance of a practice that may operate today. So theory, in a certain sense, is what allows things, or matter, or the real, to appear as image or imagination. So I would say that Herzog's challenge could only be launched, I would say, at a moment of the complete conflation of words and things, where the displacements and absences of words have been fully elided with the presumed matter of things. Clearly, in a way, you could say that Herzog's challenge is a kind of inversion to Hugo's prediction, which was delivered in 1832, but really in the book going back to 1482, the prediction that the monuments of stone would be overthrown in terms of we would no longer write our cultural history in stone, we would write it in paper. That there was a new technological transition, you could say, that the book would kill the building by virtue of paper or Gutenberg's movable typography as a new means to convey cultural history and knowledge through the ages. I would say that it's not the case, as you might think, that Herzog proposes the revenge of the building back on the book. In other words, it's not about a return to stone per se. Perhaps that's Zumthor's game, but not Herzog de Meuron's. I would say that, in other words, Herzog de Meuron's is not a nostalgic return to direct materiality and experience. The work is the image, and it will be both book and building, word and thing. It's now, in a certain sense, words and things, or seeing and saying, are now dissolved through the image. Now, explicitly, Herzog comment is actually about these two books, or in relation to these two texts, which we now celebrate the 50th anniversary of. And really, I would say the origin of a particular form of architectural auteur, or an architectural subject, the architect critic. In other words, the one who is precisely engaged in the collapse of writing and design, or saying and seeing. And it's surprising in some way because you could say these are the two self-identified crucial figures for Herzog de Meuron, along with artists like Judd or Beuys and Warhol. In other words, Herzog de Meuron's work is an expression or an instance of the crossing of the type of the one with the sign of the other, or a kind of combination of the evacuation of type and the proliferation of sign. So I would say that although the genre of practice that Herzog de Meuron engaged doesn't appear to be in line with what the architect critics model initiated by Rossi and Venturi are, who I think reached their full culmination, as I'll show in Eisenman and Koolhaas, but it does totally rely on that legacy and is the, as I was saying, a kind of logical apotheosis of the work. So in some sense, I would say, although this 50-year anniversary is, at the time in '97 when Herzog is looking back at that point on a 30-year legacy, saying that period is over, I think he probably had a more proximate target a couple of years before for his outburst, which is implicitly this book that appeared 30 years after the first two and is now reaching its 20th year anniversary, or just past its 20th year anniversary, which was 10 times longer, or you could say deeper, than either of the first two books. And I would say that it does mark, in some sense, the end of this 30-year paper age of architecture, which precedes what you could call our current so-called paperless age. And so in a way, Herzog's comment is on the cusp of those two moments, between the end of the paper age and the beginning of the so-called paperless age. You could say this is a book that relied on its status as a thing with size and density, a demonstration of bigness, a lesson that section trumps facade or cover. You don't judge a book by its cover anymore, you judge it by its section. It's a stack of words arranged to show what they are saying. In other words, a demonstration of the manifesto of bigness is embedded in the object itself. It's a qualitative accumulation that ultimately breaks down traditional hierarchies. So in that way, the book is a performance of the theory, this brick or CMU. Before getting to the 90s moment, though, I want to linger a bit more around our just finished anniversary of 1966, which gives us also another conflation of words and things in Foucault's, what was translated as the order of things, in French, words and things, which ties to our discussion, or also from 1966, Robert Smithson's A Heap of Language, which is, again, Robert Smithson is maybe the corollary figure in art to the architect critics that I'm talking about as maybe one of the primary artist critics. And in a way, this is also a simultaneous 50th anniversary, again, between the relationship between image and text, words and things, maybe even matter and signs, a pyramid of words, or if not stones, or maybe a perspective of language. Either way, the blocks or the pavers are words, raising the ambiguity about whether this is a text or a drawing. In other words, is this something you read or say, or something you look at or see? In that way, it's both a poem and a drawing. And in that way, it works like a calligram, a poem that shows what it's about, or a drawing with the words that describe the picture. And I would say that this is, again, this parallel moment to Rossi and Venturi of the rise of the artist critic. And in both instances, the attempt for the work to collapse those two things of sign and materiality simultaneously. That, in other words, their new job description, the new form of subjectivity, demands a kind of work that also evidences that collapse that they have taken on as a professional configuration. A year after A Heap of Language in 1967, Smithson co-curated an exhibition at the Dwan Gallery to extend his crossover between things and words. In this case called Language to be Looked at, or Things to be Read. You could say a way to short circuit the proper relation of looking at drawing or reading text. In other words, now we're going to look at language or read things. And so again, to think about this beginning as the rise and fall of the paper age in architecture with this particular moment, within this broader ambition, let's say, of collapsing those two things, the distinction I want to draw out, although it's maybe now lost by 2015, is between the two ways to approach that collapse. In other words, what I'm calling the index, or what I would say here is things to be read. That's what I'm calling the index, things you read. Or what I'm maybe advocating, which is the speech act, which I would say is language to be looked at. So I think that both vectors of this unfolding of how things and words go together parallel Smithson's categories, and I will reframe them as an index, which is to say how you read things, or the speech act, which is how you produce language to be looked at. From the side of art, still for a moment, a year after Smithson's Heap of Language, in the same year as the Dwan Gallery exhibition, Michael Fried, who was really obviously the adversary of Smithson, begins his 1967 prosecution of minimalism, art and objecthood, with this sentence. Right out of the gate, no holds barred, no pulling punches, noting the collapse of the artist and the critic. I mean, in a way, for him, the problem is words, right? The enterprise known variously as minimal art, ABC art, primary structures, and specific objects is largely ideological. It seeks to declare and occupy a position, one that can be formulated in words, and in fact has been formulated by some of its leading practitioners. In other words, his problem is artists who write and who talk. In other words, unlike himself, who's a specialist critic, a formalist critic trained under Greenberg. And so that, part of it is a fear of a kind of disciplinary conflation between job specification. In other words, Fried's the good modernist, and you could have medium specificity and job specification. And there's a bunch of artists running around who are confusing that by, in fact, occupying words or turning words into things. So really, he refers in particular to this generation of minimalists as literalists, and that's his term. And what's great about the term, and the thing about Smithson is, Fried, is that he really nails the minimalist or literalist project, even though he's an adversary of it. He actually sets out its ambitions most clearly in his attack. And so literalism, on one hand, means this, literal stuff. That's its obvious term, but it also means things constructed by words, literate and literal in the sense of the meaning of words. And so in a way, by calling them literalists, he collapsed the idea of their engagement of both matter and words or signs. And that, in fact, it's that collapse that Fried has a problem with. Not to dwell too long in the world of art criticism, Fried, although in almost every other way is the adversary of someone you could imagine like the Marxist Manfredo Tafuri, is in this sense identical. And at the same moment, Tafuri writes against the operative critic, but also against the architect critic. The operative critic is historians like Bruno Zevi and Gideon and presumably Banham, who use history as a tool on the front line to direct the direction that design should take. And this, Tafuri feels, is an inappropriate role for the historian or critic, to give it that kind of direction. And of course, he's opposed to the architect critics, who are also, therefore, architects taking on the job of the critic or historian, in favor of his own, like Fried's, position of being a pure critic or pure historian. So this is Tafuri a year after Fried. A criticism realized through images is not equivalent to a critical analysis that employs the instruments of language. In other words, he wants to, let's say, attack the architect-critic generation that is trying to turn a form of writing or a form of criticism into the built object, in order to say that criticism is in this domain of words, and it can't be in the domain of, let's say, images or things. So back to our 66 moment. And you could say that this is already a recuperation or a return to this other particular moment, 40-some years earlier. And this is the third book, actually, that Herzog is meaning when he dismisses architects who write. It's Complexity and Contradiction Explicitly, Architecture of the City, and toward an architecture which he sees just as a complete abomination. It's like, he says, the passion of Corbusier drove him to confuse writing and architecture and art. It was just a mess. It is true the book is kind of a mess. But in any case, it's clear that Venturi, a year after Corb dies in '65, is when the rebirth, or I would say the institutionalization of this hybrid role of architect critic comes into play, and clearly both are modeling themselves, which I won't get into here, on the work of 40 years earlier of Corbu. But what I do want to just point out to set out a certain structure that I want to lay in place is the end of Toward an Architecture, the collection of essays, which I've never really understood. Architecture or revolution. Revolution can be avoided. A pipe. Okay. You have to realize that maybe Herzog was right. Like, that's it? Architecture, revolution can be avoided. A pipe. And that's it. That's how the book ends. But really what it is a certain idea of the kind of transparency of image and text, or object or thing to word. And in a way, clearly, it's about the idea of the industrial perfected object type, of this case, the cooperative pipe, or what in English is the briar pipe, as really a kind of stand-in also for the domino, a kind of standardized, a new kind of classical, everything. Format's changing a little bit, guys, but it's all right. Imagine it all perfectly aligned. That this was really the, let's say, one version of that conclusion. But I guess what I want to talk about a little bit, just for a second, is this relationship of image to language, or the seeming transparency of form to meaning, or of the object or the thing to the word. Thing to word, form, let's say, to ideology. Because I think that's, in a way, the one version of what Rossi and Venturi and others come to try to undo. So if you could say, if the mass-produced object type that would allow industrial society to avoid social upheaval was a kind of problem solver, the response or the retort to that is obviously a couple years later with René Magritte. In other words, there's no longer the self-identity or isomorphism of caption and image or form and text, but there's now a short circuit or a disjunction between the two, right? This is not a pipe. And I would say that, in a shorthand, you could say that the entire experiment, could take it back to the 50s, but certainly beginning in the period in the 60s, is really architecture's attempt to revise Corbusier's conclusion via Magritte. In other words, to put a kind of slippage or delamination between the form and the ideology. Already, it starts with Colin Rowe on the Chicago frame. In other words, the problem with Chicago, what makes Chicago not modern architecture for Rowe, is that it is what it is. It's literalist, this is this. Whereas he says Mises' glass tower is something it does not profess to be. This is not this. In other words, it's, in a way, he's rereading Mies, and as he will Corb, as a kind of Magritte figure, now in the mid-50s. In a certain way, already introducing the Surrealist project, or the lack of transparency project, you could say, between form and meaning, into the modern architects that one assumed Mies and Corbusier were all about that form of transparency. So Rowe is already the first hijacker, you could say, maybe as a precursor to the Venturi-Rossi generation. As a, let's say, like Rowe, the other Magritte-like gesture is now with words in image, which you could say is saying that what I am, in this case, is what you manifestly are not. It's not like this is not a pipe. Clearly, when it's a pipe, it's clearly I am a monument when it's clearly not a monument. When basically it's the most typical commercial loft American type. You could say America's version of the domino is in fact for him a monument. Words giving to architecture what it can't do. You could say this is architecture's early speech act, a declaration about something that makes it a kind of reality. And again, I would say as part of the extension of the Robert Smithson argument, the scale of a letter or word changes one's visual meaning of the word. Language thus becomes monumental because of the mutations of advertising. This is another case where words are becoming a kind of thing, when language becomes something not to read but to look at. So now this is my quick version of history, which you'll know my School of Rock legacy here. I am a fan of Jack Black as historian, although I am going to outline a school of paper, not a school of rock. But this is basically how the story starts, with form and function, as do all stories. Let's say the modernist transparency of form and function, or you could say form and ideology is maybe a better term. Form and functionalism, form in a relationship to ideology. We were just talking to the thesis group earlier who were bringing this up, so I will repeat it. Their words, they actually identified this. But in the post-war period begins what I call this delamination of that identity or that transparency of form to ideology. And it splits when Colin Rowe says there's the physique flesh of the modern movement of Domino and Garsh, or there's the morale word, which is its justification and what it's supposed to do, functionalism. And Rowe says, now in the post-war period, we can no longer believe that they're connected. We have to go with one or the other. Rowe says, let's go with the form and leave the ideology behind. Banham basically makes the exact same analysis and just ends up on the other side of the fence. He says, yes, modern architecture never understood the gap between what it was doing, which was monumental classicism, and what it was arguing for, and we should go for what its argument and ideology was and leave the forms behind. So for Banham, in the New Brutalism essay, there's isms as a style, like cubism, an aesthetic, and there's isms as a slogan, as a movement, as an ethic, like futurism, and Banham will be on the side of the latter. And so really, in a way, the post-war delamination or separation of the two parties, in a way, is set up with these two, you could say, operative critics, Rowe and Banham. And I would say in combination with perhaps the most paper architects of all time, John Hedjuk and Cedric Price. And in a way, there were really, I think one of the issues, sub-issues you could say, is the relationship of critics and architects in this period, and in particular, the hybrid role isn't quite internalized in a single figure yet. You could say that Rowe Hedjuk is a figure and Banham Price is a figure. In other words, the paper architects here are not yet quite architect critics. They in a certain sense, anticipate a role that will be later fulfilled by the Rossis and Venturis, but isn't quite yet inhabited by them. And you could say that it's clearly all of the work, the collaboration between Rowe and Hedjuk on Lockhart, or the development of the 9 square problem in Texas, or in the case of Banham and Price, their development of the non-plan, or Banham's dedication to the LA book, which is to Cedric Price, who first called upon me to testify in public on LA. There's this kind of intimacy between the critic and the architect, which in a certain sense, again, anticipates a role that I would say is fully manifest only with Rossi and Venturi in the mid-60s. And so their relationship, Rossi's and Venturi's relationship, once they've internalized the role of critic and historian, their relationship to their parallel figures is, let's say, decidedly different than the sympathetic promotional one between a Banham and a Rowe relative to Price and Hedjuk. And so what you get is really architecture assassinated to Manfredo Tafori, Rossi's drawing that he sends to Tafori, which then becomes the cover of Tafori's book, or The Historian's Revenge by Vincent Scully, showing his 40s historical work on things like the Low House to Trubeck and Wisloki on Nantucket. So that, in other words, finally, architects, I've had my revenge through Venturi, or dear Aldo, this is what you do to my projects. Thank you. Let's say there's a kind of assassination and revenge are no longer exactly sympathetic terms to relate the critic and the architect anymore. In other words, the architect, as internalizing that role, no longer needs them, and they know it. And so the relationship becomes a little decidedly less sympathetic. I want to go through quickly for this because I think that the issues of type and sign that Rossi and Venturi outline, you could say Eisenman's extension of the project, let's say, is I would say it's not just that form and ideology are no longer identical, which was what Rowe and Banham both say, but actually Eisenman's contribution is form is no longer even identical to form. In other words, it's a kind of mannerism of the upper trajectory. Form and form don't even co-align anymore. And that's really the point of most of the early houses, maybe summed up in 76. The new theoretical base changes the humanist balance of form-function to a dialectic relationship within the evolution of form itself. The potential coexistence within any form of two non-corroborating and non-sequential tendencies. In other words, the issue now between a classical and a modernist form, fighting it out inside form. And I give that project, let's say, I call it the index, just for sake of keeping score. At the same time, you could say, I think that Koolhaas does a parallel thing to Eisenman, but says from ideology, it's not just that form and ideology aren't consistent, but ideology isn't consistent with ideology. In other words, so the same way Eisenman delaminates form from form, Koolhaas does with program or ideology. And in a sense, that's what he's doing, and at the same time, each elevator stop a different lifestyle, and thus an implied ideology. I think for Koolhaas, and I think for Jenks, as I'll show in a moment, you have to understand that for them, different style also, or lifestyle in this case, in Jenks's case, maybe style, means different ideology. And one of the things that I want to argue for, I guess, or let's say put forward in terms of when I jump to the more recent period is this, maybe the abandonment of the project of ideology. I would say that Koolhaas's way of delaminating program and program or ideology is through the idea of the plot. And the plot meaning both a plot of land, like literal geology, let's think about Robert Smithson again, the ground, but also plot like a narrative, like a story, in other words, words, the libretto. And so in a way, plot collapses almost the same way that Freud's term literalism does, or Smithson's interest in geology and signs, the same kind of thermodynamic interest. So I would say that in a way that the index side is what I call objects to be read. The plot side, or the what I would call the speech act side, is language to be looked at. In other words, an index is an object that's been transformed that then you decipher and interrogate through its process, whereas the speech act, as I will argue, is the idea of an assertion, a linguistic assertion that becomes a thing in the world. Just to say that I think that I don't want to end the story here, and so this is just a note to future development, but clearly if you were to extend into further ways these projects, because I think they are historical projects that are not identified with individuals, they're really, individuals are stand-ins for structural possibilities in the field. In other words, I'm not interested in, there are lots of people that you could flip in and out of these roles, but they are roles that are unfold because of the nature of the discipline and the oppositions that are possible within it. And so for me, Liebeskind is, let's say, an extension of the top line, and in fact, maybe the clear summary of the first three. In other words, Liebeskind's machines, the three lessons in architecture, the reading machine, which he associates with the medieval, and which I would say is the Hedjuk machine, the memory machine, which is his second machine, which I would say is his homage to Aldo Rossi, and the writing machine, which I would say is Liebeskind's homage, you could say, to Eisenman. In a way, Liebeskind summarizes the entire project of the three predecessors of that genealogy. If you're looking for a critical affirmation of this project, you could also say that Michael Hayes' book on the late avant-garde does the same, is the critical trajectory of that same axis. In other words, the book is structured exactly in those ways: Hedjuk, Rossi, Eisenman, and then the fourth chapter is about Schumi, which is a little bit weird, but then you realize it's not really about Schumi so much as it is against Koolhaas, so then it all makes sense. And if I were to extend the bottom line, I might insert Ito as a kind of system versus system. And I would say that if you wanted to extend it then from born 45 to the born circa 60 generation. I think you could say Scott Cohen and Neil. I will have this discussion with Neil later on. But in terms of the idea of how do you hybridize the project of Banham and Price with the Venturis, you could say, which I think is also Ito's project. I was, for a while, tempted actually to be really local, just to have a fight at dinner, or not a fight really, but to negotiate a debate and actually have our friend Andrew Zago up in the top. But I resisted that urge. I chickened out, basically. So I was afraid that they would gang up on me. But, well, you know, I said it now, so let's just say it. All right. Zago. But back to our earlier chart. So in a way, these two projects, objects to be read, language to be looked at, I think works itself out in the way that they consider the frame, the domino for Eisenman as this index process of a trace, the Manhattan cartoon theorem, skyscraper, the superposition of different ideologies on top of one another. It follows through the work. It is, in a way, that this trajectory, again, to try to categorize the relationships of words and things is, the index is how you transform stuff in the world into legible signs. More recently, you could say that's what we call emergence or self-organization. How stuff, biological, material, physical, becomes a kind of a sign that you decode. The alternative trajectory I'm calling, which is the Speech Act, is that sort of set out by J.L. Austin, which is how to do things with words. In other words, we use words to do things. Words, in a certain sense, have precedence. And so for me, the Speech Act is where the format got a little messed up again, the transfer. Speech Act is how you give a linguistic assertion the status of an alternative world. In other words, by saying something, it's a form of doing it. You know, the classic examples are, in other words, not all forms of speech are descriptions of the world. They are acts that instantiate a new world. So when I pronounce you man and wife, or when I say you're guilty, if I'm a judge or a minister, those words perform an event. They have they are a material act. Or if I make a bet with you, or if I promise you something, there's a series of versions of what they're not statements about the veracity of truth of the world. They're basically statements about worlds that we enter voluntarily that then have implications because of our saying them. And so, as an extension of this, I would say that largely indexical work has what I call a naturalist politics. In other words, it believes in the fallout of systems and forces, whereas I would say a Speech Act has a kind of artificial politics. It's clearly a cultural assertion that becomes a world, as opposed to assuming that the forms of material emergence give you a world. And so you could say in these two sections, objects to be read, the kind of Reggio section model versus language to be looked at, you could say the section model of Seattle. The section that I want to talk about in terms of sections and words is the third one, maybe, which is Herzog De Meuron in collaboration, back to our friend Rémy Zaugg. Yeah, I got a text from Neil. Would you like to hear it? You know nothing of my work. It really is a text from Neil, but he didn't say that. Another combination of section and words with Herzog and De Meuron's section and Rémy Zaugg's elevation, you could say. Again, another version of I, the image, or I, the picture. In this case, I feel, as opposed to I see. For the Roche Basel Research Building. Another project collaboration with Zaugg, in a way, the Augauer Kunsthaus expansion. In this case, I, the image, or I, the picture, I see. Again, you know, which I think, in a sense, is also a return, you could say, to the Venturi counterproposal. Again, a kind of version of the Speech Act, of the building as a kind of proper noun I. In any case, I see, you know, I want to complicate this a little bit and extend the project and say that, in a way, Herzog De Meuron, to me, are the hybridization of Rossi and Venturi. The Rossi and Venturi that, on the one hand, he dismisses as books, we will forget books, buildings matter, but they've internalized the lessons of Rossi and Venturi, and I think that they are a kind of crossover between the two. And unlike Eisenman, who's interested in form doesn't equal form, or Rem, who's interested in ideology doesn't equal ideology, or program doesn't equal program, for Herzog De Meuron, it's matter doesn't equal matter. In other words, there's debate within matter. And clearly, I will shorthand this, but the idea in which you could say materials detour themselves as a kind of sign or image, which is, you could say, systematic. The way in which stone, in this case, I would say becomes de-stoned, or becomes a kind of ethereal, immaterial, if not paper, project. Or as maybe to use Robert Smithson to describe the Dominus Winery, literal usage, meaning the real use of stuff, becomes incantory, which is to say an incantation, which is how words, kind of a speech act, how words bring about a changed state of affairs, when all metaphors are suppressed. Here, language is built, not written. And I think in a way, Smithson is calling forth the project of Herzog De Meuron, the words that become things. And in the same way that I would say Eisenman's version of form against form is the index, and Koolhaas's ideology, its ideology is the plot, in a way, matter against matter is the image. And I would say that there are other firms that you could extrapolate to that too, in terms of Neutlings and others. I want to get to one closure in this, because I think it relates a little bit to the end discussion I want to get at. This is an interview around in the mid-90s, right after the publication of SMLXO with Alejandro Zairapola. It's my favorite interview exchange ever. I will read it to you, pardon my length. But do you not think that semantics also becomes increasingly less relevant in conditions of rapid change, growth, or information excess, because meanings or signs tend to become obsolete very quickly? Do you not think, I love that formulation, do you not think, wouldn't anyone agree with me? Do you not think that the real potential of bigness in the generic city is the replacement of semantics and signification as relevant techniques for the production of a contemporary material culture? And this is Alejandro, who has swallowed, you could say, whole the performative critique that you might read into Koolhaas against postmodernist symbolism and signification. The enthusiastic junior member who's putting words in his mouth and saying, doesn't your project really mean finally we can be totally performative and end signification? And then Rem just says, I think you're incredibly naive about science. Which, you have to realize, that hurts. Sorry, I know what I was talking about. And so in a way, Alejandro also tries to, whoop, that was the end of the first part. All right, now I set the time for the 1/3 remainder, which is the second part. That was 40 minutes, this is now 20 coming up. Just trying to keep me honest. So Alejandro, in a way, his project is a collapse equally of Eisenman and Koolhaas in this way, but he assigns Eisenman the term control and Koolhaas the term power, and he says that they are inadequate separately, and he will now combine control and power. And I would say his other terms for that are organization, material organization, construction organization, geometric organization, and iconography. What is the kind of association, the symbolism, the rhetoric, the communicative power of the project? And in a way, he's hybridizing Eisenman and Koolhaas in the same way you could say that Herzog De Meuron hybridized Rossi and Venturi Scott Brown. But subtly behind the scenes are those other critics you might associate with Eisenman, Frampton in this case, or Jenks in the case of Koolhaas. In other words, it's really Alejandro overcoming the impasse of the 1980 biennial, which is to say Frampton's critique of Jenks's iconography and scenography. In other words, Alejandro wants to have his tectonics and his iconography too, and collapse them into a new kind of performative envelope. And I would say that ultimately, unlike the previous project, it doesn't really unfold. I would say it's a new kind of closure or transparency. So in a way, it goes back to the very beginning of where we were in terms of its fusion. It doesn't really unfold anywhere. I would say, for me, it's an evolutionary dead end as a project. I think you could say another variation of it would be a kind of faith which Alejandro shares in some regard, of a kind of parametricism. So we'll just do that for him like we did for Scott, since we only have 20 minutes. When Koolhaas goes on to finish his, semantics is the science that explores the afterlife of signs. Singapore is an example of this. It has eradicated all authenticity to manipulate signs better. For instance, the death penalty, the interdiction of smoking and chewing gum. I believe these are fundamentally semantic techniques, an intelligent way of putting a country on a map. What he's ultimately arguing for is the Speech Act. In other words, here are simply legislation and laws and rules that allow us to operate in a different world, which produces a new artificial reality. And that way, I think it's, as a kind of historical project, as a Speech Act. In other words, if I'm saying that OMA in this case is a version of the Speech Act versus Eisenman's index, and maybe even Alejandro's index, Banham is, in 1961 says, history is to the future as the observed results of an experiment are to the plotted graph. The historian has the task of plotting a curve beyond the last certain point to see where it will lead. This is clearly what Tafuri has in mind when he says you operative critics are only interested, you're too interested in design and you have to have a meta critique. In other words, he says operative criticism is an analysis of architecture that has as its objective the planning of a precise poetical tendency derived from historical analyses, programmatically distorted and finalized. Operative criticism plans past history by projecting it toward the future. And that's all meant by Tafuri as a condemnation of it. In other words, that's the problem. That Banham, Zevi, you could say Rowe, Gideon, et cetera, engage in. That's in 68. You'd have to believe that Tafuri was really apoplectic then when Banham's student did this, which is, I would say, another version of history as Speech Act, because he's writing in 1970, but he's predicting the next 30 years. I mean, this is exactly what Banham hints at, Tafuri tries to kill, and Jenks does in spades. In other words, a third of the graph doesn't yet exist, but he's plotted it out. He's sort of marked out the territory for future movements. He's a one-man movement maker simply by putting words together and predicting future lines of development. And then people go and inhabit them. And that's the beauty of the Speech Act. You lay it out, and then people will do it for you. It's sort of like certain fashion designers. You can sort of say the thing, and you put your label on it, and then it becomes a reality. So this is a kind of history of Speech Act, or a kind of, again, how, but I would also say, in a weird way, it's also how words and forms come together. Because I want to go back to this issue of literal matter. This kind of weird biomorphic blobs entropically going through space, which I think goes back a year earlier to Robert Smithson's Asphalt on Eroded Cliff, which would then be taken up as a project by OMA's Geological Studies program as well. Both go back to Jenks, both go back really to Smithson. And maybe a final caveat of that, book mountain, which is to say words that have become geological, a mountain of books, surrounded by a crystalline envelope. You could say that the dream of MVRDV's library really is Smithson's heap of language, the pyramid of words standing in for rocks. And then to close with Herzog De Meuron, really super quickly, I guess. In this case, they turn not to Rémy Zaugg, but actually to Patrick Blanc, the landscape designer. In this case, the section Herzog De Meuron, the elevation now Blanc. But again, the wall of words here are plant names, but in a configuration of the way that plants will grow. It's another form of calligram. You could say that in a way, Herzog De Meuron slip out the ground from the horizontal plane to make it a vertical plane. It's a different version of how you just simply cut and paste, remove the ground plane, float the building, make the ground plane a vertical elevation, take the existing stone and dematerialize it by being weightless, and in a certain sense becoming a kind of the reality becoming a kind of Photoshop attachment to something that is new that now seems that it was there before, the first thing that was there. The kind of inversion of materialities, but also the inversion of temporalities. And so again, Blanc's, you could say, calligram of garden of words that in a sense become graffiti, or vegetation that becomes a kind of graffiti. And so the last image by Rémy Zaugg, back from the Basel project, imagine we the words, we close our eyes, and you, man, cannot imagine anything anymore. So in other words, unlike the earlier wall paintings in the project, here it's not an I, the painting that's talking, or I, the image, it's we, the words. The words have eyes, you could say, and if they close them, we can't imagine anything or image anything anymore. So to update Corbusier, you could say, the problem isn't eyes that don't see, but words that don't see. Words are what allow us to see, and saying again is a kind of seeing. Now, this postscript is Chicago postscript, which I call easier done than said, which is a mess. That's why it's easier done than said. I just wanted to jump to the present to sort of think about how this one period that I think extends through Herzog De Meuron, and then in a certain sense as the instance of it, in a way they had to deny it by having internalized it so well as a project. And I would say, it's impossible really to generalize about this kind of the biennial, really probably any biennial today, the one in Chicago from this fall especially, and it's a live programming. 100 offices, 30 countries by their account. It resists discourse, and I would say it's designed to resist discourse. In other words, it's designed not to be generalizable. That's its point. And so I don't want to say that this is an exemplary or exceptional or even egregious, but merely characteristic of the moment. It's not an evaluation. Now, when these kinds of events happen in Chicago, you get the local response, which is hope and fear. Hope from some people who think, finally, we natives will be enlightened by more experimental forms than we've been able to produce, and fear by locals who say, what right do they have to come in our backyard and tell us what to do? I would say that the reality of the biennial is that both the hopes and fears were left unrealized, which is to say that it wasn't an issue of Chicago catching up to the world, but the implicit lesson is that the world has caught up to Chicago, sadly. And what I mean by that is that the reality principle of Chicago, the practicality of Chicago, the build, don't talk, that basically the city that works, this is the ideology of the show, and it's the ideology of all the work. In other words, the kind of parochialism that I, as a returning Chicagoan, sense in the city is now global. We have global parochialism. Which is to say, so it's, the world is now a big Chicago, for better and worse. For worse in my mind, but, I guess, in other words, the reception of the show, which I think is interesting, was if you wanted to generalize it, you could say it's about a return to the real, and so the people say, it's great we've returned to the real, the only criticism is we're not quite real enough. Or it's diversity, that's great, maybe you're not quite inclusive enough. It's the end of the stars, that's great, maybe you didn't quite kill the stars enough. In other words, all of the show is accepted, and the only criticism are it didn't quite do it enough. So in other words, the terms of reality, a return to engaging the urgencies of the day, the issues of diversity, the issues of death to the starchitect, as the journalists are fond to say, are all confirmed, but to the extent that they criticize the show is that those things weren't actually taken far enough. It's a little bit like being in the Manchurian candidate world, where they hold up a list and say there were 200 communists in the government, and then the next day it's 230 communists. And he says, dear, can't you just agree on a number? And she goes, no, because no one is saying there aren't communists. Now they're saying how many are there? This is sort of it, like that we've agreed to this, and now it's just a question of how far, how more real can we get, how more anti-authorial, anti-auteur, because for me the starchitect, that journalistic term of dismissal, is really a critique of the development of the auteur subject that I identified in the front half. In any case, and this is where Craig comes in. Smartness turtleneck. Because the title takes its title from the State of the Art of Architecture from 1977, a symposium that Stanley Tigerman organized, and so this is a kind of reprise. At least it's a borrowed title. I wouldn't exactly say it's a reenactment, but in any case, it's a placeholder. And one of the things that's interesting, I think, is this shift in that, let's say, 40-year period, and kind of the 40-year period I'm talking about. So in this case, there's Helmut Jahn, Stuart Cohen, Craig, Michael Graves, Frank Gehry, Jim Freed, Tom Beebe, Larry Booth, Charles Jenks. Stanley was there, obviously, Robert Stern, Eisenman, Hedjuk, Jim Sterling. Basically whites, grays, silvers, Chicago 7, and some international people. And then the new version, which is now, in a certain sense, the biggest comment really is that it's, look how far we've come. You've come a long way, baby. We're more diverse, there's more people, they're from all over, they're different colors, they're different genders, different generations. And it's true, but in a certain sense, the generation born circa 1930 versus the generation born in 1970, they're just different worlds. It's just a demographic fact of life, it's a structural shift. Nobody gets credit for that. In other words, that can't be the basis of celebrating a show, that's just a statistical fact, which drives me nuts. But this is part of the metric of the current political economy. Because for me, what this show, not this show in particular, but in general, the world we operate in is, to use a fancy term, it is the political economy of neoliberalism. And what drives that is a particular metric sensibility. Because I think the other issue in this generational transition, you could say that what's telling is that in a way in 77, the participants were selected in order to debate positions. Whereas in 2015, you could say the public is rather convened to witness results. And so I would say that the first version is a way to advance difference as a construct. In other words, we're constructing difference. Whereas the latter one is to celebrate diversity as a fact, a statistical phenomenon as a fact of life. I think that those moves are not insignificant in the different political economy that architecture finds itself in vis-a-vis mid-60s, mid-70s to the early part of this millennium. You could say that the first State of the Art of Architecture was staged during the me decade, but really what we end up with now is the you millennium. And by that I mean the shift from first person to second person. It's no longer my ideas, it's your needs. And for me, that's a loss, actually. A move from the age of ideology or an age of disagreement or the possibility of disagreement, possibility of belief, to an age of innovation and empathy. And so the second title of the show, the unofficial title, you could say, is 96 Days of Innovation. And so this is really where I think it turns the corner, because for me, in some sense, innovation, I would say, has nothing to do with architecture. In other words, part of the city's ambition was to raise Chicago's then rank in innovation, which was like 26 or something, really bad. International tourism was like 10, surprisingly low. So really the ambition of having a biennial was to raise those rankings, of course, because that's a metric. The city needs to operate within its metrics. But I would say that, unlike newness and novelty, the business connotation of innovation presumes answering a need. In other words, demonstrating an impact on society, lower costs, economic growth, increased productivity and efficiency, creation of added value, expanded markets. You're looking to increase returns on established givens. That's what innovation does. Innovation's time frame is now, or let's say at least next quarter's product line. And so although the term innovation conjures a kind of risk-taking, I would say it's really only about more, the world we live in, only more of the same, just bigger, cheaper, bigger. In other words, innovation for me is utilitarianism masquerading as futurism. And I think that the question of how a city's innovation envy, how architecture might answer that, is not entirely clear, because historically architecture hasn't answered those questions, either in its 60s configuration or historically. In other words, I would say that architecture is less concerned with, this is where I expect some discussion afterwards, satisfying needs than it is in anticipating them. And even a critic as interested in innovation as Reyner Banham knew this. he said that the peculiarities of architecture really are not particularly useful for the provisions of shelter. He says that's an accommodation that Banham says, quote, on their good days, all the world and his wife can apparently do better. In other words, that's not really what architecture does. And so for me, the problem is architecture, when I talked about that generational debate, I kind of think it's also a red herring. In other words, I don't think it's really about a generational transition, because I think it's about a flattening of generations. In other words, it's about a kind of flattening of history, a kind of end of history, which is this perpetual presentness, this perpetual nowness that innovation demands of us. Whereas I think architecture's temporalities are archaic and future in some weird collapse. In other words, our job is to recombine those forms of temporality exactly against the present or as an alternative to the present, and not the kind of perpetual now that is what innovation imagines as the benchmark for its metrics of improvement. So I don't like innovation. The other maybe historical thing that I think one can start to talk about in the work is again, going back to a year before the Chicago Symposium, there was a show called Idea as Model, which had many of the same protagonists as the Chicago Symposium. And I would say that, in that case, the idea really was, that you could free models, let's say, from their traditional instrumental attachments. In other words, no longer propaganda for clients, no longer simulation of three-dimensional materiality, but to liberate the model as a divisive conceptual document. And I would say that today, by contrast, we'd enter the world not as idea as model, but really model as building. And we call that BIM, but we call that lots of things. Rapid prototyping, the kind of mock-ups, demonstration homes, the kind of genre of work that you could say is, I wouldn't say pervasive. Again, it's hard to generalize the show, but I would say are certainly one aspect of that part of the biennial. And, in a more maybe sympathetic context, this transition from the, let's say, mid-60s, something like John Heyduk's diamond houses to projects by Herzog von Ellerigshausen from Chile on the right, who are also in the show. In some way, you can see the kind of rehearsal, let's say, of them. I think they're very talented. I like the work. The kind of rotated axonometric studies, the kind of drawings and painterly elaborations that they do, the kind of seriality that Heyduk developed. That in a certain sense, these projects are the unhomely recurrence of, in some ways. But I think what's interesting is the decidedly different ends that one puts those projects to. In other words, at Heyduk's moment, it was architecture only to the extent that it resisted building. Now it's architecture only to the extent that it gets built. It's a very interesting transition. In other words, Heyduk's project was how the project transforms from the rotated axonometric to the rotated plan of the diamond to the then rotated flat square projection, which is flat of the three-dimensional. Whoop. That's the end of part 2. In 2 more minutes. Whereas in the new generation, really the issue is not about representation against representation. It's really about an ideal geometry meeting the reality of construction industry trade, and the architecture comes out of that interface or that collapse. In other words, the geometry meets construction is the result of the architecture. In other words, they shifted the production model so that, in fact, building must be achieved as its architectural complement, as opposed to the idea that architecture, 9 times out of 10, needs to resist that realization. So I think even though there's a formal similarity in investigation, the conclusions, you could say, couldn't be more different. And part of it is, and so I would say that's the sympathetic version of the BIM phenomenon. Or another case where, in this case, the project on the right from Sydney, others, stripping down the suburban house, which is, celebrated because it's about breaking down the McMansion, saving energy, blah, 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 blah. In fact, no understanding that it might have a slight resemblance to something that happened in 1978. In other words, it's not even conceivable as architecture without that. But that in fact, everyone, the participants, the critics, the journalists, are only interested in justification, not in genealogy. In other words, it's the new words that justify it, not the fact that there is actually history that made it even possible to conceive as architecture before that. Which gets me to another event that Zaugg and I were at during the same time, and this will sort of end it. It was at the Van Allen Institute, and all these offices started showing projects, and it didn't matter whether they were KPF or, SOM or Studio Liebeskind or some other small boutique firm. I couldn't tell one tower from the other, if you put a gun to my head. But they all, and they all said the same things about them. The thing is, what they said about them and those towers had nothing to do with one another. The towers looked alike, what they said sounded alike, and neither of them had one to do with the other. And so the kind of things they said, I will use, this is the group participation part. Sorkin, Betsky, and Gordon Gill in Chicago, the Architecture Biennial issue of Chicago Architect. The three conclusions are, by each of these authors, Sorkin, Betsky, Gill, figure out how to make our world more beautiful, open, and sustainable. Commit to projects that are environmentally sound, economically viable, and intrinsically beautiful. Invent forms of urban organization that will lead to sustainable, equitable, and beautiful futures. So those are the choices. Tell me who said what. And also understand that it's in the context of them promoting their own work. In other words, in Sorkin's case, it's studios that he did here at City College and Harvard. It's Betsky, it's his role of dean of the Frank Lloyd Wright School. Gordon Gill, it's his role as partner of Smith Gill. In other words, we're supposed to just say, forget about that business model because we're saying the right words. When we say them, by the way, these are the answers. If you said D, don't care, I agree with you. But I think it's indicative of the time that we live in terms of this transition from 77 to now, which is to say that in 77 you had words and you had forms, and they were different than one another, and they had a loose affiliation with the other thing. In other words, some people might have an equivalence equal of word and form. Some words might totally consume the form. Some form might totally consume the words. Some might have a serial attachment to words to explain the entirety of the form. You could have different relationships, but there was a relationship. Today you have forms, really maybe techniques is a better way to say it, and words. And neither the twain shall meet. You could say you have R&D, or product development, and marketing and advertising. And they're totally separate endeavors. And I think that that's where we're at. I think that's the loss of ideology. This is a culture really which is about doability. And as maybe Kathy Langho says in her sympathetic review of the show, and this is she's meant to sound is supposed to be a good thing, it's not about big names, and its message, the show, is architecture can be defined in individual personal terms. I find that bankrupt. I don't think architecture is something you can define in individual personal terms. I think there's a discipline and a discourse around which there are things you could say that aren't architectural. It's not just you come as you are. This is a shift from to the second person, I would say, and to the kind of atomization of public life that allows any response to be equivalent to any other. Bring to it what you will. It's kind of abdication of responsibility. And so the phenomenon, I guess, that I would see in these things is, in a way, it's indicated by the two shows within a show. Because I think the message of the exhibition is, let's say, 1980, or take an exhibition, even frankly, 2014. There's an architectural idea or agenda that an exhibition is a format for, and the content is an architectural idea or debate or discussion. Today, the form, the medium of the exhibition is now the content. That's what we deliver. We don't deliver ideas, we deliver exhibits. And this is like kind of McLuhan, old forms, old media become new content. We recycle a format or a medium, and it becomes tomorrow's. When we get a new format or a new medium, old media becomes new content. And what we're conveying is no longer architectural ideas, what we're conveying is exhibitions. And so the fact that we have exhibitions in exhibitions is part of an indication of that. I would say that what that means is the show is really about a new kind of professional, let's say the curator, or curationism, as some people call it. In other words, architects used to be that job. but now we have a professional specialization that does that job for us. And so it's not about, when there was one ideology like modernism, or when there were serial ones like white, gray, silver, Chicago 7, et cetera, architects could control the debate. But now we're presented with a world that's so different that we can't possibly handle it ourselves. And so in a weird way, the lack of message in the show is a justification for the role of those who've given us a lack of message. In other words, we need curation because we can't possibly make sense of it all. In other words, diversity is part of the need in order to establish a new kind of professional specialization that, in a certain sense, like all the other kinds of specializations architecture has seen in the last 20 years, technical specializations, historical, theoretical specializations. It's not surprising that the mediated curatorial one is another place where that job, let's say, has been farmed out and specialized. And that to me is if there is a message in the show, it's chaos, but a method to the madness. In other words, the method is to reestablish a new kind of professional role, not to actually identify trajectories in the field. I don't want to be Mr. Ho-hum all the time, which I often am. There are, lots of great moments in the show. There's a couple that I think are incredible contrast to that, which is Sue Fujimoto was just one. I think he's interestingly positioned in this space between the major vectors, I would say, in sensibility are earnestness, let's fix the world, and irony, let's critique waste and excess. These are the two poles at which most of the work operates. They are the parts that are built one-to-one and most expensive. Let's criticize waste by having the most material excess. So in a way, the Tatiana Bilbao house and the Moss house are stationed as two of those one-to-one mock-up versions, and then there's this kind of minefield of tiny little models by Sue Fujimoto that I think are actually much more architectural. It's called Architecture is Everywhere. It's clearly a reference to Hans Hollein's Everything is Architecture, although I think Inside Out. And then the other, which I won't talk about, which is the Bow Wow installation in the middle. So that wasn't quite pulling it together, but that was an attempt to talk about the history and the kind of a current event, which is not special one way or the other. I think it's more a tendency that is the world that we live in. Thank you. Good night.